Hello, my name's Chris Gibson. I was an Army officer as well as enlisted. I served in the invasion of Iraq and also the surge of Iraq, which is what we'll talk about today. Um, I joined the Army in 1990, right after high school. I grew up in Merritt Island, Florida, in Brevard County. And after a short summer vacation, I was in basic training. While I was in basic training, actually, the first Gulf War initiated. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait back then. While I didn't deploy to that one, it set the ground for what I ended up doing years later. Um, but today we'll talk about the invasion. So in 2003, I was with the 82nd Airborne, 407th FSB with the 82nd Airborne. It was part of Second Brigade, the Second Brigade Combat Team. Third, it was 325. Um, we went over there right before hostilities kicked off. Can't remember the exact dates, but it was before the war officially started. We were moving troops over there. You had Third ID and 101st, and then Fourth ID was going to be coming down through Turkey, which ended up getting delayed. If you look at the war overall, you'll see that they came at a later point, and we did most of the push with the Marines and the Army from the south and from the east side. Um, my particular role in that initial push, I was a first lieutenant at the time, and as that we were the Bravo company, which actually had the mechanics. So I was in charge of the mechanics, but also the airfield departure was the ADAG. So it's Airfield Departure Control Team. I can't remember the exact acronym, but our job was once we took the airfield, if we would parachute in, we'd take the airfield with the infantry, and then my job was to set up a reception for when the planes landed with other equipment, all the different vehicles, and then we would divvy it out to the infantry units. We would get them their equipment. So that was going to be my role for the taking of Baghdad International. At the time, it was called Saddam International. Um, Hindsight now, I realize like we were actually a deception. They used the threat of us sending paratroopers in to take uh, Baghdad Airport. That was the mechanism to force the Iraqis to bring the Republican Guard back from Karbala, where I believe it was the 101st and the Marines were mainly fighting them, and it forced them to pull their forces back into Baghdad. Thus, we were able to destroy them on the way back and render all those units inop. So then they had to resort to more guerrilla warfare, and then as we pushed up, that was what we actually ran into more of. So in the lead up to the invasion, after deploying, after leaving Fort Bragg, we were down in Kuwait. At the time, they called it Camp Champion. Um, a lot of the names of the bases that I'll say they changed over the years and with different units. But we were Falcon Brigade for Second Brigade 82nd. Um, like I said, I was one of 70 non-infantry MOSs out of the jump force that was supposed to actually jump in. Um, I would go up and I'd see the intel reports and how much anti-aircraft was around our target area. And that one thing specifically I remember is there was a battalion of Iraqi tanks about 4 kilometers from the airport. And I uh, thought to myself, it's not going to be a good thing if those are still there when we jump in. But you overcome those type of fears as you're preparing for combat missions or any mission, even if it's a training mission. As a paratrooper, jumping out of a plane, you have to overcome that fear to get out the door, and you have to. It's not natural to jump off of a high area with just something hooked up to you. You know, if you got a rope, it's a little more comfortable because I can think that rope hands up. But when you're leaping out with a parachute on your back, you're trusting that equipment to open up and get you safely to the ground. And it's some people can't do it. They can't get over that fear to do it. But when I finally did fly up, like I said, they used us as a deception, so we did not jump into the airport. ultimately. And I want to say it was about 2 weeks. The war initiated, and it was about 2 weeks into it that they called off the jump. It may be a little bit longer. And then I flew into Talil Base, which was a southern, I think it was the southernmost Iraqi air base in the country. It was right by Nasiriyah. You could actually see Nasiriyah in front of us. And at the time, the Marines were fighting over that terrain, so you would see the Cobra helicopters going back and forth. And then on the main supply route, you had all kinds of army convoys, Marine convoys, and what they used our unit for at this point. The enemy had let the tanks basically bypass and go up, and you had it was considered an irregular force. It was more of a paramilitary force, but they had the Iraqi Fedayeen. You see this helmet here, looks like a Darth Vader helmet from Star Wars, and that actually is what it was meant to look like. And one of Saddam's sons, this was his paramilitary force that he created and was in charge of. And you may not be able to see it, but on the side there's a little silhouette of Saddam, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it was pledging loyalty to Saddam. So everybody in this unit had to pledge that they were loyal to Saddam. They wore this helmet along with a black mask, and their gear was all blackened out. Their uniforms were black, and that was all meant for an intimidation factor. But what a lot of these guys did, they went into a guerrilla warfare mode after Third ID and the tanks rolled by. They started attacking the supply convoys that were going up north. And our mission with 325 was to take some of these smaller towns that had been bypassed, and we went and took them over and basically eliminated the guerrilla warfare people in those areas, and took them to safeguard the supply routes as we moved up to Baghdad. This wasn't my first combat experience. I had been in Somalia in '92, so I had been on the other end of being shot at and having mortars dropped on me. But this experience, like all that, everything that happened in that conflict was like a small skirmish to what I witnessed in the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was the U.S. seeing the full force of the U.S. brought down on one of our enemies, and it was quite impressive. You watch different movies, and there's several different shows on the Iraq War, and a few of them get it right, some of them don't. But seeing the artillery and the aircraft doing bombing runs and different things like that, and just the chaos that happens in combat, it definitely was that war. Even me being I was a support position. I was an ordnance officer at this time, so my job was not kicking in doors like the infantry guys. It was supporting the infantry guys. My guys fixed their items. That doesn't mean that we didn't receive fire, because we got ambushed. We got lots of rockets and mortars shot at us. So you have that inherent danger no matter what job you do in combat, with some being more dangerous than others. But it was quite an experience, and it opened my eyes to what America can actually put forward when the call comes. I also remember my unit, one of the big battles we had was a Samoa. I had an incident where a helicopter crashed. It was a medevac. No, it wasn't. This one was actually a Navy helicopter, but I was set up in a convoy. We were going to move out in the morning, so we had the trucks lined up, and we were sleeping on top of the trucks for a couple hours before moving out. There was a helipad probably about 100 meters if that, from us. And I heard the helicopter coming in, and then they have what they call brownout. So in the desert, when a helicopter comes in, it kicks up all this dirt, and you just see the dirt roll in front of you, and then you can't see. So I kind of pulled my poncho liner up, saw there was a helicopter coming in. I saw the dust coming, covered up. Next thing I know, I hear a whop, pop, 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 and I'm thinking to myself, are they shooting it down? And please don't let this be the time that I go, because I had very big items whooshing over me. Pieces of helicopter were hitting on top of us. And then it was just over, and then we all ran up, started pulling people out of the helicopter. Luckily, no one was even injured. It was a miracle. We had, I was about 100, like I said, about 100 meters away, but we had people that were within 50 meters of that pad and nothing. Even the people on the helicopter, no one got hurt. But what had happened, it was a Navy Seahawk, and when he came in, he thought he was on the deck, and he was about 5 or 6 feet off. He let go of the stick, and the rotor blade hit another helicopter that was on the ground. And that was that popping that I heard, was the rotor blade going. And that's probably what saved us, because that helicopter took the brunt of the items going in. We also, later on, we rolled up, we went through the Ramadi area, the Fallujah area. There was a set of bridges in Fallujah that, when we rolled through this particular area, almost every other area at this point, we had defeated the Iraqi army by this point. So the only thing that was left was there was a few of the key leaders we were looking for. So you had cells of Iraqi military that would still shoot at us or try to attack. But for the most part, it was quiet. The Iraqi people were actually pretty happy in general with not having Saddam, especially in that southern area where they were primarily Shia Muslims, and he oppressed the Shia Muslims very, very badly during his time. I mean, you can do a whole video just on the things he did that were atrocities over the years. But we rolled through Fallujah, and I can't remember the exact wording, but across these two buildings, they had a banner, and it said, GIs, basically said, GIs, our women and children will kill you. And that was going through Fallujah, and if you studied Iraq, 2004, and then later they had another uprising, that was a hotbed for the enemy, and like right from the start, they let it be known. So that was kind of a psychological operation against us, which later on I ended up doing that as my job. In the Iraq War, I didn't do psychological operations, but I'll show you a leaflet. This is an example of what psychological operation leaflet would be. And on the back, you have the Joint Task Force. So this is all the different countries' flags that were involved in the joint operation. And then on the back, I don't know if you can get it to where you can actually see it. And you'll see on this little diagram on here, you have a helicopter and a tank blowing up the other tank. So the one being blown up is obviously the Iraqi tank. Now when you do paper products like these, it all depends what your target audience is, but you try to communicate with a picture what your message is. So this is one trying to get, because you even have like a stealth fighter on there, if you can see right here, little thing of a stealth fighter, and that was to scare the Iraqi troops into surrendering, because basically we're going to come in with overwhelming force and blow up your tanks and the best weapons you have, so you should just surrender. That's the whole message of this. Without me being able to read Arabic, I can tell you that just from the picture. One of the other forces that we fought that was the main Iraqi force that was actually trained and well equipped was the Republican Guard, and this is an example of their beret, and you can see the eagle on there. And the eagle is actually the eagle of Saladin, and the Ba'ath Party, which Iraq was part of, And it was the Ba'ath Party originally was Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, I believe, when they formed up, and they were a pan-Arab movement. So it was an alliance that these countries put together. They all trace back to Saladin, which was a Arab conqueror back in the Middle Ages. So Saddam actually had his bloodline traced back to saying he was related to Saladin, and I think even Muhammad at some point. So that's kind of the trying to think the word. He was trying to show that he was like historically his bloodline was great, and that he's a great ruler, and that was the type of things that they would go back in the Arab history and connect themselves. Now the Republican Guard, they were the ones they had relatively high tech tanks. I know they had the T-72. So for the Arab nations, they had pretty new equipment, all old Soviet designs, but not as high tech as what the Russians have currently. Um, they also they also had trying to think the jets they had. At the time we invaded, they really didn't have a flying air force. Pre-invasion, they took the planes that could fly and flew them into Syria, flew them into Jordan, flew them into Iran because they didn't want to lose all those planes because they knew with the coalition against them, they would have no air force. One of the locations we rolled through was an air base, and there was an old 50s British jet, and I can't remember the model, but it was one that at some point the Iraqis had acquired it, but they had them out there sitting on the runway, and we had bombed this air base, so the runway had every about 100 or every 50 meters to 100 meters was a giant crater, so it couldn't be used. Um, and Pretty much it was a those ones were all abandoned as we rolled through. But eventually we ended up coming through that area and going into Baghdad, and then it was about 6 months into my 12 months that I was there for that deployment. Um, we were in southern Baghdad at that time we called it Camp Falcon. Um, this is when I actually started working with Iraqis a little more because we had hired some to work on the base. They would do things like laundry or manual labor, and then one of the things I was tasked with was going out and cleaning up some of the blown up vehicles and getting some of the ordnance. During the invasion and them fighting us, there was all kinds of artillery rounds, rockets. Some had been fired, some were just laying there from where the Iraqi troops left. There was landmines. I came across cluster bombs that were actually U.S. cluster bombs. One particular incident, um, we were walking along and uh, I had an Iraqi come out. There was a truck that had been blown up, so I had the crane there and we were picking it up. And I had an interpreter, but Iraqis would come up to me and say, "Oh, I have a bomb in my yard. Can you get it?" And this guy had a little garden not too far off. It was within eyesight of where we were. So I walked over and eyeballed it, and there was a bunch of bomblets. They looked about the size of a soda can, and if you've ever seen a hand grenade, the fuse on top kind of looks like a hand grenade. And some of them had a ribbon, some of them didn't. But these were bomblets cluster bombs that we had dropped on the Iraqis, and these particular ones had just stuck into the mud. At this point, it wasn't muddy, so the mud was kind of like concrete at this point, but you had them sticking up. So I marked them and then reported it up for the explosive disposal guys to come through and clean up later. And but you would have, I had things like that happen. The IEDs had not started. The insurgency was just starting up about that time. Um, and I want to say maybe 3 or 4 weeks after that incident is when the IEDs started. And And then there was more of a focus of getting all that ordnance off the terrain. There was a school we went to. I'll give another instance. We had a school that we had met up with the mayor, and we were going to help get the school set up so the kids could go back to school. Right out and back in the soccer field was bunkers full of bombs, landmines, RPGs, just full. And you could see where the insurgents had just drove up and took what they wanted and drove away. So we called that one up. Um, it's one more thing I'd like to talk about before I'm done.
You have 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay. Sorry. um, you, as you go through these situations as a soldier, um, you make a bond with your fellow soldiers, and I have friends from when I was an enlisted soldier in Somalia that I still talk to all the time, but I also made friends during this one. Um, Overall, my deployments, I was pretty lucky and never had a close friend get killed, but we did lose. We lost one of our guys, Lambert. Was actually they determined it was celebratory fire, but they were just out in back of the warehouse and got hit in the back of the head and fell over. We rushed him to the medics, and he didn't make it. We also had other incidents with civilian casualties where there was a bombing where we ended up bringing all the civilian casualties to treat onto our base, brought in a truckload full of civilians. Um, at one point, like when the insurgency picked up, we we were mortared. They would mortar us almost every day, and because we weren't doing counter battery fire, it started out what they would do is they would drop a mortar and then have an IED set to get the QRF, which is the quick reaction force. So if the QRF went out, they would light an IED off on that vehicle. So they quit doing that. We weren't allowed to do counter battery fire on the mortars because we were in the city and they didn't want any civilian casualties, which culminated in them just dropping more mortars on us. And I think that the one of the worst nights, I could set my clock by. I'd be talking just like we are now, and you'd hear doom doom doom, then this woom woom woom, and they'd walk it on our base. It seemed like they would always walk it right past my building, over on the other side, and the shaking from some of these explosions was like the old war movies where the dust comes out of the ceiling. And my particular building, I had a little brick building, so it was pretty good unless we had gotten like a direct hit. We were okay. But going through that every day, you're at like a high state of alert. Other units had quite a few casualties along the way, and you pull together and you're really just watching out for your buddy at that point, just trying to get through the time to where where you all come home. Um, trying not to have a mistake that's on you. I would have, like, when I would go out on missions, I had my one driver, Torres. There was only two ways that we could go, so I'd like left or right Torres, and then that way we didn't repeat. We'd, instead of going, because you don't want to be repetitive, because if the enemy's watching, that's when they're going to hit you if you come out at the same time every day or go the same direction. And I had days that we went left, a vehicle got blown up going to the right. A couple times it would have been me who got injured and or killed, and you'll have that in the back of your mind, and you just got to put it away and keep moving on. But that time in my life, being with the 82nd Airborne, jumping out of planes, I I discovered what I can do as a person, what I can handle. I've never been so cold. I've never been so hot. like just utter extremes that you never thought you would go through or do. But I did it all in the Army, and I don't regret a bit of it. Um,
Hey, Chris, what, if I could interject, what led you from that career field to the one that you ended up in?
well, so now I'm actually a logistics manager for Amazon. So the being a logistician, I was particularly in charge of mechanics, but you learn how to navigate the supply system, order supplies. For Amazon, really just convoy operations is what I'm doing there. So getting your vehicles there on time, getting them loaded on time so they're leaving on time and can get their packages delivered. It's the same thing in the Army. You have a convoy time that you start, you load up, you leave at this time, and then that way on the other end, those supplies or whatever get to where they need to be in time for it to be used for whatever mission they're meant for. So taking that ability to plan and
Execute.
and execute, yeah, and execute on a timeline is really the biggest thing that I've been able to take and put towards my civilian job.
What would the average, what do you think the average young person should take from uh, our involvement in the Iraq hostilities?
Um, well, with that, I loosely mentioned when the Iraqis were happy, and I had some workers that there was one worker in particular I remember, and early on they were starving. They didn't have any food. They were looking for money. So you can imagine the chaos of their lives, because there was a certain point where they had to just stay in the house because they might get caught up in a firefight or mistaken for the enemy. But I had one worker that he thought I got him the job. Really, I didn't get him the job. I just pointed him to the guy to ask for the job, and they hired him. And he thanked me. He ended up working in our PX. We by this point we had set up a little one, and he thanked me. He's like, "Thank you, Lieutenant Gibson. I got the job, and I can feed my family." And he spoke some English. That guy was an engineer before the war. I met a couple like that. This particular guy, he's like, I'm an electrical engineer, and we had there was like an electrical substation on the thing, and we were moving something around. He's like, I could fix that. I know how. And but just the knowledge base, and he was down to really being a register clerk. That's what he was doing at RPX, like stocking the shelves and being a register clerk. But he was an engineer, but doing what he had to do to feed his family in that chaos. But ultimately, their government. I urge you to like read up on what Saddam did and the atrocities that he did to the Kurds, the Shias. I mean, some of it very brutal, and some of the stories that people told me, that they told me that if you didn't have a picture of Saddam in your house or your store, Saddam evidently would just drive around and randomly go in stores or even people's houses, and if he didn't see the picture of himself, he wouldn't say anything then, but later you'd disappear, and they would just snatch people off the street and murder them, and that's just very oppressive totalitarian government. And we got rid of that. They still have plenty of problems with the.
First, was there still kind of civil war? Was it still kind of a civil war?
Yeah,
And it's between the Shiites and Sunnis.
yeah, the Shia, and then you throw the Kurds in there
The
also,
Kurds,
because the Kurds up north want their own. They want their own independent area. The Shias and the Sunnis have had long term problems with each other, and now the government is more Shia run. So in some ways, I think they may be doing what the Sunnis did to them, which feeds into the whole ISIS issue,
Yeah.
and all that also. In fact, ISIS was able to gain traction specifically for that. long-term strategic mistakes from the world, from people way above
Yeah.
our level. But it gave those people a chance.
Okay.
So,
Okay. And, no, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.